According to Western media reports, NATO could propose membership to Ukraine along the lines of the FRG in the 1950s and demand that Russia freeze the conflict along the front line. The main question remains why Russia should respond to this. On his very first day in office as NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte enthusiastically spoke out in favor of Ukraine joining the military alliance and allowing Kyiv to launch missile attacks on Russian territory. Apparently, the man has recovered well during his vacation in the period between the resignation as Prime Minister of the Netherlands and the move to Brussels, and is now ready to start the Third World War or the First Nuclear War with fresh forces. Rutte thus showed that he is by no means better than his predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg. Shortly before his resignation, he even suspected that Ukraine could be admitted to NATO without having regained control of the lost territories. He also said that an invitation to join the alliance could serve as a tool to end the conflict. A seemingly insane statement. After all, the conflict began precisely because Ukraine was dragged into NATO, which is unacceptable for Russia. But there is a Jesuit logic in the words of the General Secretaries, which makes their actions predictable. As is known, a meeting of Ukraine's main allies will be held in Germany on October 12th, with the participation of the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, Germany and France, as well as Vladimir Zelensky. He will again beg US President Joe Biden for permission to use long-range weapons, although these requests are pointless before the US elections. As the Financial Times sources suspect, instead of the long-range attacks, Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will give in on another point and lift their unspoken veto on Ukraine's NATO membership. Zelensky could receive some very secure final paper on this. Vor welchen Herausforderungen steht der neue NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte? What challenges does the new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte face? At the same time, before the end of hostilities, there can be no question of Kyiv's full membership in the alliance. This has already been confirmed by all the above, with the exception of Zelensky. This means that although membership is postponed, according to Stoltenberg, it is at the same time a means of ending the conflict. Apparently, Biden and company want to repeat the scenario of 1956, when West Germany was admitted to the alliance. The FRG did not recognize the GDR, considered the territory in eastern Germany to be its own, and did not even want to give it up for the sake of joining NATO. A similar situation currently exists with the Ukrainian government. For this reason, West Germany was admitted to NATO in a special way, with the clause that the alliance only protected the territory controlled by the FRG, but not the territory claimed. This means that NATO considered the GDR to be part of the FRG, but did not extend the principle of collective defense to its territory. Now, the GDR corresponds to those Russian territories that Ukraine considers its own, including Crimea. If it had joined the alliance, the Ukrainian leadership would have received protection guarantees only for those areas it actually controls. And if Russia's forces were to cross the line designated by NATO as the boundary of its zone of control, it would mean the beginning of a military conflict between Russia and NATO. But, as we remember, for Ukraine to join NATO, the fighting must first end, precisely because the West does not want to wage a direct war against Russia and is actually afraid of a Third World War. Therefore, Moscow would have to agree to a freeze of the conflict without Ukraine and the West, recognizing Russia's new borders. Why NATO thinks Russia should agree to this is the most interesting thing about this scheme, because it is also the most puzzling. There may be some kind of carrot in the form of easing economic and sanctions pressure. In the event of refusal, a whip is provided, which could be wielded in the form of the aforementioned permission for the use of long-range weapons and mass missile deliveries. Media report: Scholz considers phone call with Putin. Chancellor Scholz was chosen as the messenger to convey the terms of such an agreement to Russia. As German media have found out, he is planning another telephone conversation with the Russian President Vladimir Putin in November after an interruption of 2 years. The conversation is to take place in the run-up to the G20 summit in Brazil, to which both Putin and Scholz have been invited. The West probably wants to secure the support of its plan from those G20 members who have so far taken a neutral position, such as India or Saudi Arabia, in order to put pressure on Moscow on their behalf. It is not excluded that NATO will propose to Russia to be satisfied with Kyiv's commitment not to militarily recapture the lost territories. In practice, this means that the leadership of the rest of Ukraine and its NATO allies will wait for history to open a window of opportunity for them. In the past, such a window opened under Mikhail Gorbachev, allowing the FRG to annex the GDR and the Baltics to secede from the USSR. But the main problem for Russia is not the risks of a distant future. Namely, the former respected partners and current leaders of the unfriendly states continue to turn a deaf ear and refuse to hear the essence of what Russia is trying to convey to them. The main reason for everything that has happened to Ukraine in the past 3 years is the attempt to drag it into NATO. Without it, the special military operation would not be necessary. Kyiv's renunciation of joining the alliance is Russia's main condition and the basis of the so-called Istanbul Accords, which were supposed to end the conflict in the spring of 2022. In many respects, it is still ongoing because this condition has not been accepted. Consequently, the agreement prepared by the West makes no sense. For Russia, the subject of the hypothetical negotiations is that Ukraine could receive some concessions for not joining NATO, and not in the fact that Russia could receive any concessions if it does not oppose Ukraine's joining the alliance. Whether in part or in full, Ukraine as a NATO member is unacceptable, period. The reasons for this have been explained hundreds of times. The West always counters Russia that Ukraine, as a sovereign state, has the right to choose its own foreign policy fate, which is a norm of international law. But in addition to international law norms, there is also common sense. And this dictates that existential threats to the security of great powers must not be created because they will not allow such threats anyway, while the consequences of their elimination will cost everyone dearly. For Russia, for example, an existential threat is Ukraine's accession to NATO. For the US, this became the stationing of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came very close to a Third World War, and thus the first nuclear war, because Washington was willing to launch a first strike against the USSR just to avoid exposing the US to any risks from Cuba. According to international law, the US should not have attacked the USSR just like that, especially at the price of a nuclear apocalypse, because the Soviet Union would undoubtedly have responded. Moscow, on the other hand, had the right to station nuclear missiles in Cuba because there were no contractual restrictions in this regard at the time, and Fidel Castro himself asked Nikita Khrushchev to protect the island of freedom with Soviet missiles. Despite all this, no official historiography sees the Cuban Missile Crisis as an arbitrariness on the part of Washington, which almost doomed the planet because of the whims and paranoia of the United States. Even in the USSR, this crisis was declared by the ruling party to be one of the reasons for Khrushchev's dismissal. He was not accused of withdrawing out of fear of war, but of provoking the United States to do so and starting such a war. Despite the ideological differences and the sincere fear of each other, Moscow and Washington understood at the time that if you enter the enemy's vital zone, it can end badly. Moscow still understands this, Washington no longer does. It invents peace plans without being aware of the causes of the war. That's bad, very bad. Think ahead.